Hi, everyone. Welcome to our webinar on the J&J pause and vaccination status report for employers. We're happy to present this insider's view for you today. I know it was kind of scheduled on short notice, so we appreciate your participation. This is Karen O'Hara. I'm the Director of Marketing and Communications with WorkCare. The session will last about 30 minutes. We can go a little longer if there are a lot of questions, and we'll be recording it, so it'll be posted on our YouTube channel within a day, and we'll also be transcribing the question and answer session and posting that on our website. Those of you who were attending our weekly COVID-19 webinar series are familiar with our format, and we'll be following the usual process. You'll be on mute for the duration of the webinar. Please submit your questions using the Q&A function in Zoom. I'll moderate the questions and we'll answer as many as we possibly can in the time that we have allowed. I'm really thrilled to introduce our presenter. We're so lucky to have a physician on our team who has experience having worked at the FDA, and so he really does have intimate knowledge of the processes that they use to ensure the safety of vaccines. Christopher Jankowski, MD, MPH, is our Senior Vice President of Clinical Operations. As I mentioned, he formerly held critical leadership positions at the Food and Drug Administration, where he served as an expert in vaccines and gene therapies. He's board certified in occupational medicine and neurology, and he's actually treated patients who've had the type of blood clots that you've probably heard about in the news that have been associated with the J&J vaccine. So I'm going to turn it over to him. Thanks again for joining us.
All right. Hello, everyone. Every day, Johnson & Johnson's been in the news now for 2 straight days. I am following along with this, and I volunteered to give this talk because I think it's really important to understand that this is actually a point in history where we have some of the best vaccines and vaccine technologies and some of the best safety that we've ever had for vaccines. And I'm going to try to relay this to you and relay my excitement about how vaccinations for COVID are really going to change the world and make the world a safer place. Keep in mind, we no longer have smallpox. It has been eradicated from the globe, and we haven't had polio in the United States for decades. And this is all because of vaccines. So vaccines absolutely work. Nothing is perfect, but I think the US is going to do quite well as the world, and the vaccines are going to continue to move forward. And I'm going to go into the vaccine pause for J&J. Let me just start off on the next slide here. If I can move my slide forward. As was mentioned by Karen, I did work at the FDA for 5 years. During that time, I worked with a lot of the people whose names you're reading about in the paper. So I know most of the major players. I was sort of an insider there for 5 years. The people you're reading about have a lifetime of vaccine safety under their belts. I have essentially 5 years. And since that time, when I left the FDA, I've been working with Fortune 500 companies, very heavily engaged in COVID. I've also been working for the National Vaccine Injury Compensation Program through the US Department of Justice, working on neurology cases following vaccination. So that's something which I've been pretty heavily engaged in as well. And prior to that, I really was in the real world, actually seeing patients in the hospitals, large medical centers, as well as serving as leader and manager for multiple programs, including as residency director for occupational medicine, and also in the submarine force, leading the Pacific Fleet medical programs. And I've been sent pretty much all over the world, including, well, I'm not going to go into all that, but many places in every continent. And I remain an associate professor at a couple universities. So this is sort of something I do have some inside knowledge of, and I want to share that with you today. Keep in mind, every vaccine, I mean, come on, everything has adverse events. I mean, occasionally, if you drive a car, you're going to have a recall of some part of the car. Occasionally, you'll read that a Tesla will light on fire spontaneously. but you keep driving your Teslas and you keep driving your cars, and we're going to keep using vaccines, but we're going to try to make them as safe as possible. The messenger RNA vaccines from both Pfizer and Moderna, if you've had those, as I have, and many of you in the call hopefully have, there's a very low risk of anaphylaxis. So we keep you for about 15 minutes after your immunization, and we make sure you don't have any trouble breathing or low blood pressure. And we have, a shot of epinephrine to give you if you do. So everything has some small risks. And we go through tens of thousands of patients in clinical trials to make sure that these vaccines are safe and effective. But once you get into millions of patients, once you market it and millions of patients take this, you might find something. And that's why we have very robust monitoring systems, which I'm going to talk about, to sort of reassure you that things are actually happening to keep American public safe, as well as international. For those, many of you have international operations as well. This was the joint CDCFDA statement. This was just on April 12th, a few days ago. I've highlighted in yellow some of the things that are really, I think, the reason this was put out and put out very promptly. The last bit in yellow talks about people who have received the J&J vaccine. If you developed headaches, abdominal pain, leg pain, shortness of breath within 3 weeks after vaccination, to talk to your healthcare provider. We want people to be aware that this is an adverse event with clotting, particularly brain clots, which may occur. So this was put out there. There are currently probably 2 to 3 million Americans who got the J&J vaccine within the last 3 weeks, out of a total of about 7 million J&J vaccines. So this is actually something which over the next 3 weeks, additional cases may occur. And we also want the physicians to know that if somebody comes to you with this, then you have to be careful about the treatment, because this is not the usual blood clot. It's sort of some thrombosis in combination with low levels of platelets. So this was what came out a few days ago, and this prompted a lot of concern. There's a lot of news articles on this. Again, my spin on this is that we have such good safety monitoring that we were able to find this early. And the other spin on this is a very rare event. And I'll try to highlight that as we move forward. So a unique thing about the Johnson & Johnson vaccine is it uses an adenovirus. This is not new. The Johnson & Johnson adenovirus platform was used when the Ebola virus was a problem in Africa a few years ago, and when Zika virus was coming up through the Caribbean and South America and other places. And they actually use this vaccine for these viruses. The Ebola vaccine was actually approved by the FDA last year. It's actually an approved vaccine. So these adenovirus platforms are not necessarily new. They've been around for at least a decade, and there are other adenovirus vaccines which are in use. So a new technology, but not entirely new and novel, and they've been thought to work pretty well. Again, in tens of thousands of people. The Ebola vaccine is not really used in the US because we don't have Ebola right now, even though it's approved. So this is the first adenovirus which has had millions of doses. All right, so we were on a pause. You guys have all read about this, right? 6 women, age 18 to 48, 6 to 13 days after vaccination. I'm not going to go into that. You guys have been reading the news. That's why you're on this webinar. The Oxford AstraZeneca has had similar problems, also an adenovirus vaccine. And a lot of the countries I've mentioned, I have listed below. This is a New York Times article from 10 April. Some countries have said we're not going to use it. They just said, some European countries have said we're not going to use it at all. Many European countries said, we are going to use this only in the elderly because we think the young people may be at risk. So they're looking at vulnerable populations and trying to make a best guess on what those vulnerable populations might be and making sure they don't get it, so that you don't have a 1 in a million adverse event by having, a blood clot. So that's where AstraZeneca is. And now another adenovirus vaccine is the Russian vaccine, the Sputnik V. And the Sputnik vaccine, we don't really have a lot of data. We don't really know. But as I talk to my colleagues, there are concerns likewise that the adenovirus from Russia, the Sputnik V vaccine, also may have some problems with clotting. So this may be overall for adenoviruses. Now, again, adenovirus vaccines have been used for a while. They appear very safe, but once you start using them in millions of people, these things may come up. Again, rare events, but they may occur. Talking to my colleagues, we think this is probably something which is real. And as we continue to use adenovirus vaccines, we may have to decide how to limit it for certain populations that may be more vulnerable. So that's the pause. Let me mention to the whole group, okay? I was working as a neurologist and as an occ-med physician for 2 decades before I ever went to the FDA. And a lot of my value to the FDA was because I was manager and I was able to get things done, and I was able to lead teams, and I was promoted 3 times while I was at the FDA for that 6-year period. And I myself had a lot of scientific publications. I'm going to go through my publications because they were mine, but keep in mind, I only have like a handful on this page. My colleagues who are actually making the decisions in the ACI and in the leadership in the FDA and the CDC have hundreds of publications, been doing this for decades. But this is the type of stuff you're going to see. Adverse events, Journal of Pediatrics, post-licensure surveillance for influenza. There's actually a journal called Vaccine. Comes out every month. There's a lot of articles on vaccine. Safety surveillance, the Journal of Biomedical Informatics. I wrote this with a number of colleagues at the FDA who have PhDs. I also worked with, and this is new systems for figuring out how to work with big data, how to draw big data in and find 1 in a million cases. We also brought in some projects from IBM Watson at the FDA to look at big data. Duration of protection, like how long is this going to be effective? This was for the herpes zoster vaccine. Clinical Infectious Diseases was a journal. Keep in mind, infectious diseases and vaccines go hand in hand. So a lot of people are published in multiple publications for that, both vaccines and infectious disease. Safety surveillance, influenza, adverse events, adolescent health, safety surveillance, human vaccine, immunotherapy. You're going to read a lot about immune system effects. So vaccines, infectious disease, immunotherapy, all tightly, connected. Narcolepsy and pandemic influenza. How crazy is this? We all met in Brussels in 2018. This was published in 2019. And the title of the article is What We Need to Know Before the Next Pandemic. So this was in 2019. We met in Brussels. Tom Shimabukuro was a CDC guy. I was the FDA guy. We had all these Europeans there. And sure enough, in 2020, we had our next pandemic. Tom Shimabukuro from CDC, you'll see his name frequently. He's often quoted in some of the newspapers as well. Risk of febrile seizures. This was an article I did with our colleagues at Harvard. Again, we have a lot of collaboration with the FDA and outside institutions. And then again, at the FDA, we also look a lot at things like hemolysis and blood clotting, and this was published in Transfusion. So again, if you can imagine me as a very small fry, seeing all this publications out there, we have a lot of scientific publications. The scientists out there know what's going on, but they don't always agree, and we don't know exactly what's going on. The human body is very complex. The immune system is very complex. A lot of research is being done, but we have extremely good scientists worldwide working on this. All right. Is a pause necessary? I believe yes. That's my opinion. Absolutely necessary. We have all this safety in place because we want to find that 1 in a million thing. We want to make this safer. We want to know how to treat the people who have it. We want to avoid giving the vaccine to people who might be vulnerable. I think the pause, in my opinion, is probably going to last for a few more weeks. Okay, we still want to see the 2 million people who got it in the last 2 weeks. Let's see if we get 1 or 2 more cases. Okay, and let's look at those cases very carefully. What do they have in common? Are there certain ways we can predict who might have an adverse event? And if so, we're not going to give them the vaccine. So I think the pause will last a few weeks, and then it may be like in some of the European countries for the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine, we only give it to those over a certain age. What to do if you've had the Johnson & Johnson vaccine in the past 3 weeks? These are 1 in a million events. Essentially, if you've had the vaccine, just monitor yourself for some of these symptoms. You have a 1 in a million chance, okay? Or maybe a 1 in 500,000 chance. But whatever it is, think of putting 1,000 people in a room, and are you going to be that 1 out of 1,000 chosen? And now put another 1,000 people, or not put those 1,000 different rooms. 1,000's a million. So if you've had this in the last 3 weeks, or someone at your clinic or someone in your company has had the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, the chance of one individual, unless you have 1 million people in your company, if you had 100 people receive it or 1,000 people receive it, it's very, very unlikely that you're going to have anybody in your company who's going to have this adverse event. So numbers wise, it's very, it's almost like winning the lottery in the opposite in a bad way. So just if somebody had it, reassure them, tell them to get a good night's sleep, tell them to eat healthy, drink water, the normal things that you do. And that's probably the only advice I can pass along. What do we do in post-marketing surveillance? Like, is this a real thing? Like, how do we know what's going on out there? So number one, we have this V-Safe vaccination health checker. When I got my vaccine, I signed up for it. Every day they would send me like a text message, how you doing? Checkbox, could do a couple of check boxes. And then it was like, after the first few days, it was like once a week, you know, how are you doing? It's a nice thing to have. We have the vaccine adverse event reporting system. We get hundreds of thousands of these things. We get a ton of these going into the FDA. We look at them very carefully. I had individual physicians assigned to every vaccine, you know, to make sure that we're checking these. And then we're looking again at things like, you know, IBM Watson and artificial intelligence to sort of like very carefully look at these to find signals, to find a safety signal. We have near real-time surveillance. When I was at the FDA, we worked with Kaiser Permanente, we worked with Harvard, we looked with Medicare. So imagine, if you will, you're a Medicare patient, you go in to get a vaccine. Wherever you go, they're going to charge Medicare. They're going to send them an invoice for like $29 for for giving you the administration of the vaccine. And that bill goes into Medicare. If you're admitted to the hospital a week later with like a blood clot, they're going to send a bill to Medicare. Medicare can look at all of their data and they can try to match these things up. And that's what the FDA is probably doing right now, trying to get near real-time surveillance. Are we seeing signals out there? Are we seeing safety signals? A lot of time and effort in the United States is spent on this. It's a really robust system. Lastly, we have vaccine manufactured reporting. So every time we approve a vaccine, they have to send us an annual report. And whenever there's an adverse event, they got to send it to us within like a couple of days. And we can also require post-marketing studies and have that vaccine manufacturer do additional studies. So an enormous amount of post-marketing surveillance. And then I should also mention, we have international collaborations. I was on the phone with the Europeans, with the Japanese, with the Canadians. There is a lot of international collaboration. We all have very similar vaccines. We're sharing this information. And you're going to read articles about this, that everybody is sharing this information and seeing what's going on with other vaccines, whether it be Johnson & Johnson, AstraZeneca, the Sputnik vaccine, all these adenoviruses, we're putting all this together. So very, very robust. Messenger RNAs, we can still use these, okay? We will continue our country's vaccination until Johnson & Johnson is released from the pause with these messenger RNA vaccines. When these first came out in December, I thought that they had some pretty good studies. They're pretty good, but I may not have been the first person in line, okay, in December. But now it's been 4 months, 185 million doses administered. That's an enormous amount of data. And as I just showed you, we're looking at it. The US is looking at these 185 million doses, and we have not seen another safety signal. Johnson & Johnson, 7 million doses, we found a safety signal. The system works. If there's a 1 in a million adverse event, we're finding it in Johnson & Johnson. We're not seeing anything on the 185 million doses. Paperwork's going to be submitted by both of these companies, I think, soon for full approval. I'm really excited about this. This is, I mean, having worked at the FDA, this is an enormous success story that our safety systems are working. We're finding these small cases, these small numbers of cases, and we're not seeing anything for the messenger RNA vaccines. Mutations. Okay, you can ask questions if we have to. Hopefully, we have time. You can talk about mutations as well. Evolutionary biology. Okay, it just every living thing, including viruses, they evolve, and these small changes that are going on as far as the mutations in the COVID virus are going to come around. They're going to try to evade our natural immune response. They're going to become more sticky so that they will infect more people. They will do other things to sort of stay alive, right? So evolutionary biology, we're going to see these mutations. Oftentimes, if they're less severe, then people will go out and spread them more. If they're really severe and they kill you within a couple of days, it's probably not going to spread really well. So oftentimes it's thought the mutations, which are going to become dominant, may be less severe. We don't know though. We still want to be careful. You should still get vaccinated. We can certainly make booster vaccines to address these viral mutations, but currently the messenger RNA vaccines are still pretty good against the known mutations we have right now. It may not be 95% effective, but maybe it's 80% effective. You know, maybe it's 75% effective, but there's still effectiveness there. The AstraZeneca was not so good with the South African mutations, but the messenger RNAs appear still to be pretty good against the South African and the other viral mutations we've had thus far. So again, I'm pretty confident that the current vaccines being used may not be 95% effective, but may still be 80% effective against mutations. And over time, we can have booster vaccines to address these. So all good news. So summary, vaccines are safe, not perfect. Johnson & Johnson will probably come back on the market in the next few weeks, but there'll probably be some restrictions for use. If they're restricting it from younger people, it may be more difficult for a company with a population of employees in the younger age ranges to have like an on-site visit to give a lot of these vaccines. So it is going to affect your day-to-day business. It may slow down some of your vaccinations, but that's where we're at currently. And as we're asking questions, just please keep in mind, this is the data. This is the facts we have thus far. 31 million US cases of COVID. Probably more. We're probably not capturing them all, but we have 31 million. We're just going to put that down as a number. And COVID deaths of 563,000. So 18,000 deaths for every 1 million COVID infections. Now, I would probably agree with people to say, well, there's probably more cases, and a lot of those who died early on were the elderly in nursing homes. So going forward, we may not have as many deaths, and we can treat people better, so that we'll probably have fewer deaths. That may all be the case. So instead of 18,000 deaths per 1 million, maybe there's 10,000 deaths per 1 million. Maybe there's 5,000 deaths per 1 million. Let's go down to 5,000. That seems like a pretty drastic reduction. But 5,000 deaths for 1 million COVID infections. And yet if we can prevent 1 million COVID infections with 1 million vaccinations, and we have one person with a clot, with a severe clot, these are severe things. I certainly would not want myself or my family or anyone I know to have this blood clot. And then there was one death out of those 6 people thus far. So this is all sort of put in perspective, and you're going to hear the CDC and the FDA and other countries debate this and say, if one person gets really sick out of 1 million from the vaccine, but we're preventing thousands of potential deaths and other illnesses, people who have like long-term injury and illness from COVID, from sort of long-term COVID infection or long-term COVID symptoms following COVID infection. Once they're recovered, they're not fully recovered. This is the direction where the discussion will go, and you'll read about this in the paper in the weeks ahead. So with that said, I'm going to open it up to questions.
Thanks, Dr. Jankowski. This is Karen again. Please submit your questions using the Q&A function. The first question is from someone, it appears to have had the J&J vaccine, and it's actually a 2-part question. How long are those of us who receive the J&J vaccine supposed to be experiencing side effects? Who do we contact beside our primary care physician if we have severe bruising from the vaccination?
So severe local bruising from the site, like if it was administered in such a way that there's local bruising, you're probably going to be okay. That may be something, though, that you want to talk to your primary care provider about. Frankly, if you have any concerns that this is serious and you're anxious, I would not hesitate to go to like an urgent care center or something to reassure yourself, because that's sort of why we have urgent care and emergency rooms. And you may feel a little embarrassed for like elevating it to that point, but that reassurance may go a long way. And this is a national point in time where we have a pandemic. And so I would, if you have serious concerns, I would not hesitate to try to get to your doctor. And if they can't see you, to go to an urgent care or an ER. But frankly, again, if you can imagine 1,000 people in a room and only one person is going to have this adverse event, and the other 999 are going to be okay. And instead we're talking about 1,000 rooms with 1,000 people each, and only one person is going to have this. So, but honestly, if you're hesitant, if it were my family member and they said, hey, I'm really anxious, and I talked to them on the phone and they have anxiety about it, we have emergency rooms, and acute care clinics to look at these things. And I would not really hesitate to go, or, find a doctor. If your doctor can't see you, go to an urgent care.
Speaking as a neurologist, if someone were to develop some of the more severe symptoms that could potentially be a sign of a blood clot and it occurs at the workplace, what do you recommend the response be? Is that a 911 emergency call? Is it take the person to the nearest hospital yourself? What should employers do?
Either one of those may be appropriate depending on the situation. This is such an incredibly rare thing. I don't think anyone listening to this call is going to have a patient who has this. But if you do, the issue is you have decreased blood flow in the brain because there's sort of some thrombosis and some clotting there. That's going to cause a headache. But I see patients with headaches. As a neurologist, like almost everybody has headaches. So it's a very common thing. It would be a severe headache, and it would be a headache which over time as your brain, as that clot occurs in your brain, the pressure will rise in your skull and you'll have visual problems. And then you can have a stroke, and that's really serious. So you sort of, it's a super rare thing, but it's probably, if it's an unusual headache for you, then you should probably go to the emergency room, and you can have someone drive you if it doesn't feel too bad. But if it feels like it's a bad thing, you can call 911. But if it's your normal headache that you get frequently, it's probably not this condition. This is something which again is a pretty rare condition.
Okay. Is there a diagnostic tool beyond clinical symptoms to indicate that these rare blood clots may be forming?
Oh, great question. Yes. Because this is associated with low platelets, there's probably blood counts you can do. There's imaging studies for sure that will find a venous thrombosis. So those are usually like MRI scans. Looking in the back of the eye, you can see swelling in the optic disc. So if you have a little handheld scope to sort of put up to some person's eye and shine it in their eye, look in the back of their eye, you might see some evidence of early papilledema, what we call it, which you would stop early on. You will stop seeing the spontaneous venous pulsations in the back of the eye, and later you can see frank papilledema. But early on, you can look for those venous pulsations. If you're not a neurologist, you're probably not looking for spontaneous venous pulsations. You probably never look for them. If you go to a neurologist, absolutely they will examine you. As a neurologist, I would do like a full exam, and I would be able to like tell you pretty certainly whether you have it or not. But those of you who have access to an emergency neurology specialist, not many of you on the call probably have that. Because of the anxiety, I would probably take this relatively seriously if it's a really unusual type of headache, or any of these other, you can have blood clots in other places. The AstraZeneca vaccine is more associated with that, but we're still learning about the adenovirus vaccination from Johnson & Johnson. 7 million sounds like a lot of vaccines, and it is. But this is such a rare adverse event that we're still learning from it. Okay.
Yeah. Can you speak to antibody-dependent enhancement?
No.
I don't know what that means, so I can't interpret it. Perhaps the person who asked that question could elaborate on the source of their question. To answer one question that just popped up, yes, we do have a fact sheet. It's actually a FAQ that we posted 2 days ago, and we'll be enhancing that. And we're also going to be posting the answers to questions. Here's a couple more before we run out of time. You already answered you predict that the pause will probably last several weeks pending future cases that might emerge from the most recent round of vaccines. How do you think this pause is going to affect the supply chain in general? I know in California where I live that the J&J vaccine is a relatively small percentage of the overall supply compared to the other two that are available, but I'm not sure what the status is nationally.
Yeah, so the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices, the ACIP, they meet at the CDC, or they're out of the CDC. They're really, these guys are great. I've known many of them in the past. They're tremendous clinicians, and they're really solid advice. So they met yesterday and they decided to keep the pause going. In their discussions, which I think you can download their discussions. I think they audio or videotape all of these, and they're available to the general public if you want to, listen to the whole meeting. It sounds like some were saying, let's wait for a few more weeks. And then some were like, we still have a pandemic. Let's meet like in a week. So I think they might meet in like 7 to 10 days. And I think they're probably going to lean towards continuing to use the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, and just limit who might be vulnerable. So in the interim, the Johnson & Johnson was so easy to deliver. It doesn't require complex, cold chains, and it doesn't require a second dose. It's something you can just sort of, put it in a minivan and go down to like the poor areas of, like, I grew up in Los Angeles, right? So you go down to Skid Row, where right now there's all kinds of people living in tents, and you can give them a whole bunch of Johnson & Johnson vaccines, from a mobile van. It's much more difficult for these vulnerable populations. So I think it's going to be approved, and in the interim, it's going to slow down a lot of our vaccinations, but I think it'll slow it down by a period of weeks or months. I think the hope was that everybody gets a vaccine by the end of June. Maybe it'll be a little bit delayed, but I'm hopeful, because of the availability of the mRNA vaccines, that we can still cover the whole country. And there's still other vaccines that are in the wings that may be approved in the near future as well. There's other vaccines that the FDA will be looking at in the near future.
All right. Yeah, those don't get as much publicity, but there are additional ones in the pipeline. Just a couple more questions. We've been out of our half hour, but let's just try to squeeze in a couple more. What should employers be advising their employees who are not yet vaccinated to reduce any possible symptoms that they experience from the vaccine, like feeling fluish or achy, headache? Is there remedies they can take the day they get vaccinated that might help reduce those symptoms?
It's currently not recommended that you pre-dose with, NSAIDs or anything right now. It's not really a recommendation. The best recommendation is the day that when you're going to get your vaccine, for a few days ahead of time, just make sure you're sleeping well, eating well, the normal good habits that you would build in, so that when you do go in to get your vaccine, you have a healthy immune system and you're not overly stressed. And that's probably the best advice to prepare for a vaccine. And then after the vaccine, it hits people differently. Some people, are flat out for, 12 hours or 24 hours not feeling well, and others have no symptoms at all. So it's sort of a hit or miss thing. And we've told employers that you may have a small percentage of your employees who, following a vaccine, may feel pretty terrible for a day or two, and just build that in, that you might have some people who may not be able to work for a day, sometimes 2 days. But other than that, I think the vaccines have been going pretty smoothly, and most employees have been able to just work through whatever other adverse events they have. Again, very short-term adverse events. This is unusual, again, to have something which occurs, a couple of weeks out of having this thrombosis. As a neurologist, I'm concerned. I get people with headaches all the time, and I always have to be very careful to make sure that it doesn't indicate something serious. And these 1 in a million cases of venous thrombosis are something serious. So it is absolutely something I don't want to try to downplay, but it is something I think we can avoid after the pause if we limit the population.
What are the chances of it being a coincidence rather than related to the vaccine in these 6 cases?
All right. So when I was at the FDA, I was actually in charge of supervising, a couple dozen people who are PhDs and MDs, and almost all of the safety concerns that came through to us were not validated, and they were not real. They were all just coincidence. But you have people who were convinced that, they had the vaccine and something happened. So almost all the time I found that it was just coincidence. This particular case of thrombosis with the adenovirus. It seems to be across other adenovirus vaccines. It appears to be highly unusual. This is a very specific type of thrombosis. I think this is probably not a coincidence. I think this is probably something which is a real thing. Now, we'll wait for, again, as I said, these experts on these panels have like literally hundreds of publications, and they've dedicated their lives to this. And the science is pretty well known, but it's extremely complicated. And so I think this is probably going to go down in history as something that's just a real concern, but it could end up being a coincidence. And so we will, but I think most of the physicians I'm talking to think this is probably a true association rather than a coincidence. And I'm just speaking for myself. Okay. I'm not speaking for any government agency or for work here. So,
okay. We got an elaboration on the antibody-dependent enhancement, but I think we'll answer that offline because it's rather complicated and you probably would want to give it a little more thought. So the person who asked that question will get back to you and we'll publish the answer with our Q&A. Just to wrap up, Dr. Jankowski, if you could be a fly on the wall in any workplace and you're dealing with a vaccine hesitant population, and the J&J pause hasn't helped overcome objections, what do you think the fundamental message should be for an audience that doesn't have clinical background and is hearing a lot in the popular media to overcome that hesitancy? What reassurance would you give them?
You know, that is, Karen, thank you for that question. The only reason that I volunteered to like come very quickly and do this broadcast is because, to me, having been engaged in the FDA, and again, it wasn't my life's dream to work with vaccines. Like, right, that was something I started when I was like in my late 40s and I went to the FDA. But I have found that vaccines, having been an insider, are extremely safe. And this actually is a demonstration of how incredibly safe these vaccines are, that not only is it like a 1 in a million for the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, but that we were able to find it within a very short period of time. Within a very short period of time, we saw this safety signal. And so we have systems in place that actually work. And if you look at the slide in front of you, if you're still looking at it, you know, 1 million people get COVID infection, 18,000 deaths. 1 million people get a COVID vaccination, which prevents an infection, and you have, you know, 1 person will have these symptoms and 1 out of 6, you know, died. And that's still, every death is significant, but we're talking about a very small, you know, adverse event for a very large benefit. And now we have 180 or so million doses of these messenger RNA vaccines, and we haven't seen a safety signal. So the fact that the United States can say 7 million doses of Johnson & Johnson, we found a safety signal, we're on this. Like, we're on top of this. We're watching it closely. 185 million doses of messenger RNA vaccines, we haven't seen a safety signal. So I think this should be a reassurance that these vaccines are safe, particularly the messenger RNA vaccines and the Johnson & Johnson vaccines when they come back on the market for those who will not be in this vulnerable population. I mean, this is proof positive that the US takes safety very seriously and that these vaccines are extremely safe. I mean, who could have predicted you give 100 million doses of vaccine and you don't have any safety signals for both Pfizer and Moderna? And then the safety signal you see for Johnson & Johnson isn't 1 out of 10,000, but is 1 out of 1 million. By the way, the 1 out of 10,000 we probably would have caught in the clinical trials. That's why we do tens of thousands of people in clinical trials. We want to make sure that it's at least safe enough that you don't have an adverse event, you know, for 10 or 100,000. But once you get into the million, you know, we may miss something, and that's why we're taking the pause. So this really demonstrates the seriousness which the FDA and the US government and world governments take this. And it demonstrates the robustness and the advances in big data and in scientific, you know, advancements, which we're allowed to have such a safe vaccine. So I think this is reassurance that the vaccines you're taking are safe and effective.
We're out of time. Thank you so much, Dr. Jankowski, and others are also sending their appreciation for your willingness to jump on this call on such short notice. Just want to remind everyone that we'll be back on May 5th with our monthly COVID-19 update with Dr. Harris. A lot of you probably attended when we were doing it weekly. Now it's on a monthly cadence. So we'll look forward to seeing you then. Thanks again for joining us. Everybody be safe and take good care.